Hello, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Co-Creators of a New World. My name is Kathleen Hanagan, your host. And yes, we are co-creating a new world, and that begins inside in consciousness. That's where everything begins. Today, I'm very excited to introduce you to a dear friend whom I met when I lived in Portland, and who has, at a stage in life when most people are settling down, sort of ventured into a whole new area of wisdom and expertise. Her name is Terri Daniel, and I'm going to read her bio to you right now. Terri is a hospice and hospital-trained clinical chaplain certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death, Education, and Counseling. The workshops she conducts throughout the U.S. help dying and bereaved discover a more spiritually spacious understanding of death and beyond through meditative, ceremonial, and therapeutic processes that focus on inner transformation rather than external events. Her work is acclaimed by physicians, hospice workers, grief counselors, and clergy for its pinpoint clarity on the process of dying and grieving, and its heartfelt depiction of consciousness beyond the physical body. She also has a BA in Religious Studies from Maryhurst University. I think you were doing that when I met you. And an MA in Pastoral Care and Counseling from Fordham University, and is currently doing doctoral research on spirituality and grief at the San Francisco Theological Seminary. And one other thing that Terri didn't write down is that she is the founder of an amazing conference called the Afterlife Conference that's happening, in November 1st. And it's truly a gathering of the great minds around death and spirituality in the world. So welcome, Terri. I mean, that's amazing. And
thank you.
So good to have you here.
Thank you.
I know that your topic is called God, A New Story. And what I've been doing is reading a little snippet from my book that sort of segues into the work that you're going to be talking about. So I'm going to read that snippet right now. And this was during a dark night of the soul for me, very important time. I'd gotten back from being away in Peru for a year, and I'd been in India for a month. And I'd come back to a house that needed to be renovated, and I didn't care about any of it anymore. And in late May, a suffocating darkness came over me. It was as if my soul was crying, longing for a place to rest. My best friend called one day, knowing I was struggling. Her genuine attempts to support me were met with my nihilism. Financial burden coupled with exhaustion from all the work had brought me to my knees, and I could no longer pray to the God I once knew. I questioned every thought and every concept, and a great doubt rose up in my soul. No one and nothing was of any comfort except gardening. The garden became my ashram, where I felt an intimate connection with the earth. So that is where I lived, in between clients, working from morning until late at night, often under spotlight so I could see. When the dark thoughts and feelings arose, I faced them, then let them go, digging and planting and arranging my hands in the dirt as often as possible. I bludgeoned roots with a shovel, releasing the rage that was rising up within me and making room for new plantings. The earth nourished me in some silent way. And I chose that because I found God in a different place at that time. And I want to read for people something that I read of yours, and it's so apropos. If we see God as a connective fiber that links every action in the universe in an interdependent movement toward wholeness, then there's no reason why this force would shield us from discomfort and conflict. Yeah. In other words, when bad things happen, it doesn't mean God's not with us.
Not at all. On the contrary, it means that God, however we define it, is with us even more. It's from the conflict that we stretch and grow. I always say it's like swimming in a pool, and you know how you push off the edge of the pool when you're going to swim across? You have to have something to push off of.
Yeah, you do.
And that otherwise you can't get any momentum, right? So that's what conflict is. And contrary to what most of Judeo-Christian theology sort of teaches, is God is not only good. God is neutral. I mean, what is God, right? And so if you think of God as a man in the sky with a clipboard assigning things to people, then you can say he is good and he loves you and he wants you to do this and that.
Paternal.
But, yes, well, paternal and parental and humanoid.
Yeah.
But if you realize that that's not what God is not a humanoid being modeled after us. God is just a creative force in the universe. It's just the that makes stuff happen.
Yeah.
And that's why in you study religions and religious history, there are so many different names for God, even names that are pronounced, because it's just, it's like a hiccup.
Yeah.
God is a hiccup in the universe. And so it doesn't have an opinion about us. It just makes it happen, with our participation.
One of the best books that I ever read was that one, When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Kushner. And it talked about the fact that, we may all, cognitively and physically and sometimes emotionally, not always, mature. But spiritually, many of us stay very young. Years old.
Another really good book like that I recommend to everybody is called God is a Verb by Rabbi David Cooper. He's the one who came up with that idea that God is a verb, which just in your mind is a heavy thing to ponder, just as it is.
Yeah.
And what you were just talking about, spiritual maturity, I did my master's thesis on a guy by the name of Fowler, James
Fowler.
Fowler. Fowler, yeah. And so he did this amazing thing where he took the stages of development, kind of like Erickson stages of cognitive development, like a child at age 2 should be able to do this, and then at age 5 they should be able to process this way. He took that and he applied it to spiritual growth. And he has it in 6 levels. And so the very first level is like a primal understanding of the divine, which is like a baby. It's the parents are God, right? Because they created you and they keep you alive and they love you. Between like 2 and 4, you go into this mythical, literal understanding of God. And I'll give you an example of that. It's a story. A man and his 4-year-old are walking on the beach and find a dead seagull. The kid says, "Daddy, what happened to the bird?" Daddy goes, "Well, it died and went to heaven." And the 4-year-old looks at the bird, looks up at heaven, because that's where heaven is, up, right? And says, "Did God throw it back down?"
Oh.
So that's the mythical literal. So Fowler puts that at like age 4.
Yeah.
And then the next stage, which is called synthetic conventional, is like around 6 to 10 years old. And this is basically kind of just going along with what your culture tells you.
Yeah. And
so most people in the world, well, I can only speak to the Western world, I don't know the rest of the world, are somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3, are somewhere between the literal interpretation of that kid with God throwing the bird down and the next one, which is, well, I know that kind of doesn't feel right, but everybody says that's what it is, so I'll just go along with it. Yes. And never questions it again. Yes. That's stage 3 spiritual development. Probably 80% of the people in America are in that place.
I read that too. And I'd love to know more about the other 3. That would be really profound to hear that, because I know that I've evolved past that, and yet I can revert back to it in a moment of stress.
Yes, it's in us.
It's in us. It's like we transcend and include parts, right? Like it's not that they're gone, but that we still have. Tell us about the 4th stage.
Okay, well, the 4th stage is, and it sounds, here's one of the things is the criticisms of Fowler stages is that they're hierarchical. It says that one stage is more evolved than another. Yes. Well, the fact is, that's true. I don't care if anybody doesn't like that. And then the next thing is to say, well, I think you and I are at stage 4. So stage 4 is where you venture out of your own cultural boundaries and you begin to embrace or consider other cultural views. So this is where we start exploring world religions, and we start being willing to reject what our society condones and starts to create our own. I can't remember what that one's called. The next one is stage 5, universalizing faith. And I think a lot of us are hovering between 4 and 5. So universalizing faith is we realize there are no belief systems that are useful.
Yeah.
We reject belief systems entirely.
Yes.
Now that we've studied all the belief systems, so now we're at stage 5 and go, you know what? We don't need any of this. We just need like a direct relationship with the divine as it lives inside of ourselves. So that's sort of stage 5. And stage 6, it kind of matches with the chakras when you think about it.
Yeah.
So stage 6 would be like the 6th chakra, which is kind of like most people can't live there and still be in a body.
Yep.
Right. So that's like enlightenment.
Yeah.
You know, that's like Buddha.
Got it. It's so interesting that you talk about that 5th stage. And I had been in India and Peru, and I'd been in India right before that. And I actually was like hoping to be enlightened, right? But the dark night of the soul that I reached was I rejected everything.
Right.
Every belief, every thought, every belief that came into my mind, cancel. It was so scary. And during that time, I worked in the garden. And a very, very beautiful woman, whom she's an intuitive, she came to my door during that time. She literally came to visit me unannounced. And I saw her coming, and I didn't want to talk to anybody. But because it was her, I went to the door. Not like me, but that's where I was. Dark night of the soul looks different than the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I let her in. And right away, when she was at the door, I said, "Oh, Deborah." She said, "How are you?" Like she knew. And I said, "As dark as ever. I've never been so dark." And I just blurted it out because she was a beautiful, spacious being, right? She said, "May I come in?" And I said, "Okay." And I thought, I don't have anything to offer right now. And I said that, and she said, "I'm not here for anything but to be with you." So we sat down in my temple, my beautiful, I had like a sanctuary in the front room, and we just sat there, and she said, "Let's just go inside." And after about 5 minutes, she came out and she said, "There's a crack at the root of who you are, and it's causing you great pain. And you're below your faith. You've gone below the faith, right? And there's really nothing you need to do. Eventually, you'll come through this, and who you are will be intact. Just go through it. Just keep working in the garden." That was her message to me.
Chop wood, carry water.
Chop wood, carry water. And that's exactly what I did. And without having to think about it or pray, because who was I going to pray to anyway? You know, the whole thing.
Right.
I came out of that, and I believe I became a new person as a result. It's not even about rejecting everything. It's just that I experienced God everywhere, and in the dirt, particularly in the plants.
You know, it's funny about the garden. I had two moments in my life where I felt like I was completely in present time and in a Zen space where I wasn't thinking about anything. Yeah. Once was skydiving.
Oh, that'll do it to you.
In free fall, after you open the chute, and it's like so silent, you actually go into present time.
Yeah.
For a few seconds, and then you go, "Oh, what the fuck am I doing? I'm falling out of the sky." The only other time I experienced that was in the garden, and I was sitting on a rock, weeding, and all of a sudden I realized that I wasn't thinking about anything.
Yes.
It lasted 1 second. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I realized it, of course, I went back into my thinking mind, but I recognized that, I was just sitting there pulling weeds, and I was completely in present time. I had no thoughts. Yeah. And those are the only time I've ever been in that space.
Empty, right?
Kenosis. Yes.
Empty of self. It's what people meditate for years to achieve, right? And
yes.
Like that connective tissue that you talk about, I find it in the garden.
Yes.
And you know, some people will say, oh, it's the divine feminine, it's the earth. I don't know. I don't want to give it a label.
Right.
I just know that that's how I felt. I had a direct experience of life, of the pulse of life, that, you know, and that's been a saving grace for me. I wanted to ask you, I don't know if I ever did, and I don't remember if I did. So what like started you off and later in life toward all of this deep research into spirituality and religion? What was
well, I was always interested in this. I mean, I was always spiritual. You know, I read the Bible when I was 16 because I wanted to. My family wasn't religious at all. I just sought that out on my own because I was like, I wonder what this is about. Then I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And then I started reading everything else. And then, let's see, when I was in my 20s, it was the teachings of Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda, right? So that's 40 something years ago.
Yeah.
So I was always doing this. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead resonated with me as the most logical explanation for everything that I had ever heard. So I kind of built my personal theology around that. But what got me interested in it academically and professionally is my son died when he was 16. And I had some extremely profound mystical experiences around that. He was severely ill and disabled, so he was sick for 8 years. I was well prepared for his death, and his death was beautiful. And he communicated with me after his death quite clearly. And so I started getting involved in the whole mystical lens through which to look at bereavement. And so I wrote a couple books and I started teaching classes, but I realized I didn't have any good credentials. So I had to go back to school because I wanted to be taken seriously by hospices and professionals. So I never went to college when I was young. I got my bachelor's in religious studies at 60.
Wow.
and then I got a master's in pastoral care. And now I'm working on a doctorate in interfaith ministry.
It's just incredible that the force, the power with which, and that you have to have the warrior for the work is that's astounding at your age. I know
it's easy because I love it.
Yes, that's right. Because
I've been in school now 10 years. So, and I'm going to be done soon, and I don't want to be done. You know, I'm thinking about getting another master's after I get my doctorate, just because I love having access to the research and spending time talking to people about this. It's so fascinating. And the people that I work with in my practice, my counseling work and my workshops that I teach, which, by the way, if anyone's interested, go to spiritualityandgrief.com. I teach a workshop all over the US, and we combine healing practices from all different cultures and also from religious traditions. So we do a lot of beautiful mystical, like Celtic grief keening, chanting. We do a lot of shamanic rituals from Peru. We do a Hebrew chant. We do altars in the West African tradition. So it's this beautiful multicultural day or weekend of grief rituals. I forgot why I was even talking about that, but I realized through all the people that I've worked with that people are bringing these religious conundrums with them into their grief experience, and it creates complicated grief. And you probably know what complicated grief is as a therapist.
Yeah.
My doctoral dissertation is called Toxic Theology as a Contributing Factor in Complicated Grief.
Oh, yes.
And what that means is if your teenage son killed himself and you think he's going to hell because suicide is a sin, your grief process isn't going to follow a normal healing trajectory.
It just gave me the chills because of like how many kids with the epidemic. Yeah, that's so true that it can interfere with the
and what I found is that there's a lot of research on toxic theology and a lot of research on complicated grief, but I haven't found any yet that links the two together.
And you actually, have subjects that you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
That's phenomenal. Wow.
Yeah.
You know, I was a hospice social worker in the very beginning of my career.
I did not know that.
I was, and the first day that I began, my grandmother died, and I had been,
Wow.
yeah, and she had been preparing me for the work because I had been working with her throughout the summer, and it was in September that I started work, and she died. And yeah, my grandmother, when I visited her for the last time, my mother and her mother were there, and my mother and my mother's sister were there.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandmother,
Her mother was probably there too.
Yeah, her mother was probably there too. There were a lot of people. There were so many beings.
Crowded room.
And I was already well advanced in my spiritual journey. So I came in and I looked at my grandmother, and she looked at me, and we had always a very special relationship, and I looked like her too. And she had black hair, but we could be interchangeable except for the color. And I bent down, my hair was a lot longer at the time, and I got down really close because she could hardly speak. So soft, you know, she was between the worlds.
Yeah.
And I said, Nana, it's okay. What's keeping you here? And she said, she was an Irish grandmother. Who will worry about everybody when I go?
And what did you say?
Guess what? I will.
Oh.
And she said, thank you.
Oh.
And she said, she said, your Uncle Billy is waiting. Your grandfather is waiting. And she named everybody. Mm-hmm. She said, they're all waiting. They have a cot for me. They have a cot ready for me. And I said, well, good. Then it's okay. She said, will you tell my daughters that I don't want to do physical therapy?
Mm-hmm.
She wanted me to convey that. She had a hard time conveying that. So you can see the training for hospice, right?
Yes.
And I said, I will. And then she said, you take care of my little girl. And I said, I will. And I didn't know if she meant me or my mother. So I just said, okay. I just said, Nana, I love you. And then that was it. And I literally had to go catch a plane. So I wrote the letter to my aunt and my mother that these were her wishes. And shortly after that, we all woke up at 3 a.m. at the same time, you know, when she passed. And wow, that, you know, I could have I could have gotten a PhD, but that was my PhD. That helped me to be a hospice social worker.
Absolutely.
That was it. That I didn't need to go back to school for that. I'm just like, it's amazing how beautiful that was. So when she passed, I remember my heart going, ouch. And then I went, oh.
Ouch. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's great.
Because I only felt love. There was no complication. That I had done all I could. We didn't have anything, as they say, mishigas in the way, right? And so it hurt, my human heart hurt, and then I could feel her spirit, you know. And I have communicated with her many times since then. Many times, like your son did with you. I mean, it's a blessing. So yeah, that was a pivotal moment in my life, right? The very beginning of my career as a social worker.
That's amazing. And, you know, most social workers don't come at it from that perspective. The social workers in hospices really lack, and the nurses too, really lack spiritual training.
Yeah.
And this is something that, you know, I mean, I'm trained as a chaplain. Yeah. So I've worked in hospitals and hospices as a chaplain. And so the spiritual care of patients falls to us, but it shouldn't, because the nurses and the doctors and the social workers should have spiritual care as part of their education. And in some places they do, but generally they don't. When you got your training as a social worker, was there any spiritual stuff in there?
No. What I was doing, Terry, I was in mystery school with Jane Houston. I was going on meditation retreats. that was all aside from school.
On your own, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, my master's did not teach me how to be a therapist. I've been for 30 years.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Credentials, right?
The spiritual care piece, and it is changing. I mean, now they're beginning to allow death doulas, to come into hospices if the family requests it. It's loosening up a little, but the rules are very rigid, and with with the HIPAA stuff and the privacy and liabilities and lawsuits and all that kind of stuff, it's very hard to get your foot in those doors unless you're a trained, certified chaplain, nurse, social worker, doctor. One of the things that we work on all the time is including end-of-life training in medical school. It's an elective, it's optional, it's not required. I have 2 nephews that are both in their early 30s who've just finished their residencies as medical doctors. So they're pretty current in terms of what medical schools are offering. And they both told me that end-of-life, palliative care, which is not the same thing, are optional rotations. They're not required. Yeah. So every doctor that you see, unless he or she chooses to specialize in that, has had pretty much no training in end-of-life care.
Yeah.
And even less in spiritual care.
Yeah. And is that part of your mission?
Absolutely. Yeah. So at the Afterlife Conference, which if you want to know about that, go to afterlifeconference.com and subscribe to our newsletter. We have, just as an example, the kind of people that we have at the conference. We have medical doctors, like 2 years in a row, we've had Dr. Christopher Kerr, who's with Hospice of Buffalo in New York. He's the medical director, and he's doing a research study on deathbed visions and dreams of the dying. Amazing. And this is a bona fide, real academic study. Karen Wyatt is also a hospice doctor. She talks about spiritual issues at end of life. So we've got doctors and nurses. We also have mystics. We've got 3 or 4 shamans that come every year and teach ritual and ceremony and death practices from their shamanic tradition. And we have, I try to get at least one religious scholar every year. We had Bishop John Shelby Spong in 2016, I think. Yeah. Brilliant guy. So we have everything there because that's the inclusive, holistic, if you will, world that we want to come to death awareness with. We want to take something from every one of those disciplines.
Yeah. You're like at the forefront of creating the new world around death and dying. And it's very exciting to watch that and to see.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but you're right. That's true. Yeah. And there's something else about that I want to say about creating this new world. Death awareness came into our culture. I mean, it was always in our culture. It went away when death and funeral rites were taken over by the church, and then when dying became medicalized. So in our lifetime, we're completely removed from all this. But around 1970, when Raymond Moody wrote his book, Life After Life, and Melvin Morris wrote his book, Closer to the Light, about near-death experiences of children, that just broke it open. And that's when Cicely, I'm blanking on her last name, who brought hospice to America, also in the 70s. Also, what else happened in the 70s? Buddhism came to America, psychedelics.
You're right.
At the same moment.
And there's a resurgence now, you realize.
Oh, I know that. In fact, one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins who's doing psilocybin research to reduce death anxiety is speaking at our conference in 2019.
Fabulous. I'm launching this book, and otherwise I'd be doing the MDA training. I mean, I being an old hippie, I'm well versed in psychedelics, and I realize, and I know the use they have, because it's, and so many people say, whether they have PTSD or they're afraid of death, they use it for people who are dying, that once you realize the magnitude of your soul and how vast you are, and that this is not the end, right? It's so comforting to people. And
And even I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's an NPR reporter who did a 4-part series on psychedelics research. And she said something, and she's much younger than us, and she's never taken any psychedelics in her life. She's not an old hippie. And she finally did something. I don't know what she did, maybe ayahuasca or something, but she said to me, "Oh my God, you suddenly realize that fear is an illusion. And if everybody could feel that and know that, society as we know it would completely crumble because it's all built on fear."
Exactly. I've been saying forever, if our politicians would go on a good trip, it would all come down, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so powerful. If you have a minute, look up a guy named Roland Griffiths.
Okay.
He's the guy who's leading the research at Johns Hopkins, and he has just wonderful things to say. So it's great. So yeah, so psychedelics, Eastern spirituality, death awareness all started to come in the 70s. So I'm certainly not the pioneer, but there are a lot of pioneers. But in terms of today, with the Afterlife Conference and my workshops and the research that I'm doing, I am kind of on the leading edge of this with many other people that, I'm always looking for more of those people to bring them to my conference. But that's
all co-creative because it is so many disciplines. And I mean, one of the most touching things that when I was in hospice myself was that there were, mostly like in the month of November, for some reason, it does seem like more people die in November. At least I found that to be true. Not a big selection to choose from, but and I had 18 people had died that were all patients of mine. And I was like, the veil was parting. So I had a lot of anxiety because I was going through something, coming to terms with death in a new way. And I walked into a room and saw a woman my age who looked like a concentration camp survivor. She had ovarian cancer, belly was huge. She had 2 children. And now it was different than seeing an 80-year-old or a 70-year-old or a 90-year-old. And she grabbed a hold of me and she said, "Be careful what you pray for. When my mother died last year, I said I wanted to go with her, and look at me now." And again, that's, a belief that was pretty limited for her. And she was so desperate, and the husband wasn't very helpful. So what happened, and it happened very organically, was the priest became her father. The nurse became her mother. And I ended up becoming the sister that had rejected her. And we all knew it. And we talked about it because she told us, "You're this, you're this, you're this." And then at the very end, she was in a hospital, and she asked that all 3 of us be there. And we all agreed. And I realized that for her, like, it was death, a passage, and it was a healing. Like, that last part of her life, she got what she'd always wanted. And that stayed with me, that, I think when we think of people who get sick or they're dying, that you almost write them off. That is one of the most important and precious times of a person's life. And it's so honoring to be able to be present. And that's what I learned. I mean,
and our culture has taught us to ignore it and dismiss it and put it in the hands of medical doctors or priests.
Yeah.
It's really, what a terrible loss for all of us. What you just described describes a process that the shamans that I learned from do around death. It's called, have you ever encountered the Great Death Spiral? Do you know what that is? No. You might want to Google the Great Death Spiral. One of the people from our conference, Kitty Edwards, teaches this. That's who taught it to me, where they do something called the deathbed reenactment. So we do this in workshops. So let's say we were in a workshop together and you were an attendee. I would say, "Okay, Kathleen, you're going to be the dying person. You're going to lay down on the bed and pick some people in the room to act out the role of your parents or whoever you want to be at your deathbed. So you'll say, all right, Joe, you're going to be my dad, and Myrna, you're going to be my mom, and so-and-so is going to be my sister. And here's what I think they will all be doing and how they'll all be behaving at my deathbed. So you sort of give them their little acting cues.
Yeah.
And then when I've done this, I've had someone play the part of my dog who just kind of lays their head on me, you know? And then we say, okay, go, action. And we act out your deathbed scene. And it's amazing how the people in the workshops really take on the characters.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So like, let's say your mother is a born again Christian. So whoever's playing the role of your mother will like really get into it and go, Kathleen, please don't die without accepting Jesus, because I will never be able to live if I know that you're in hell. And they're like, it's absolutely the most amazing process. And then at the end, after you've done all your interacting with your family members, we put a cloth over your eyes, and a person stands at your head who is a loved one who is already dead on the other side. So let's say it's your grandmother, and she calls and she goes, Kathleen, are you ready? Time to go. And she calls you. And then we do this death spiral thing where we open all the chakras and separate them from your body and lift your soul out through your crown. It's just an amazing thing. And so what you just described with that woman, she just sort of did that naturally.
She asked for it.
She just knew how to create her own psychodrama.
And I'll tell you, the priest and the nurse and I really we were like cool together,
Mm-hmm.
We got it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. And here, this is a tradition. Who knew?
Who knew? She knew from somewhere, I mean, all those traditions are out there in the ether.
That's right.
We can all tap into them all the time.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Yeah, these, what they call the death salons, is that what they call the
You mean death cafes?
Death cafe, yeah.
Yes, that's another, and that's a very new thing. And I believe that that's still happening. I did a death cafe once in Portland that I facilitated, and I got in trouble with the official death cafe trademark holder, people who started it, because I had guest speakers. I did 3 or 4 of them, and I would have a guest speaker come in and talk about a particular thing. And they said, well, we don't like to have speakers. We just want people to sit and discuss among themselves. And, you violated our rules by having speakers come in. But I think, I've facilitated enough groups that you don't just put 50 people in a room and let them talk.
Yeah.
You have to direct.
You have to focus things and direct. Yeah. So, that's so beautiful. And I just, what was the name? What should I look up about the death spiral, right? Okay.
Look up 2 things. Look up Kitty Edwards in Colorado and the Great Death Spiral and deathbed reenactment. I don't know if you'll find anything on the deathbed reenactment, but it goes with the death spiral. The death spiral is, in this particular tradition, they see the chakras as like giant screws that hold the soul to the body.
I see, yeah.
So here's the soul, here's the body, and they're screwed together like 2 pieces of wood.
Yeah.
And so when someone's dying, to assist them in dying, you take your rattle or your feather and you go counterclockwise over each chakra, and that unscrews it and separates them, and then the soul can escape through that empty space.
Oh boy, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and we do this in the workshops, but while you're alive, we will open you up like that and take your soul out for a few minutes, but then we bring it back and put you back together because we don't want you to die in our workshop.
In case anybody feels that this is gruesome, I want to say that I did attend a death cafe that Terri facilitated, and it was profoundly beautiful.
Was it the one where we talked about cremation? On that big, beautiful house at somebody's big balcony?
No, I don't think so. I don't remember that part, but I just know that I felt very close to everybody, and I felt less afraid of death, and it was beautiful.
What was that, in my apartment in Lake Oswego?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, so that was a little, it wasn't a death cafe. We did the deathbed thing there, I think.
Somebody. Yeah.
Yes, we did. That's right.
I just remembered that. So it's, to talk about death, it's like 2 things we need to talk about more are sex and death, right?
Mm-hmm.
And death is, none of us escape it. So to make it, to imbue it with the sacredness that it that's about it. I'm a biggest transition, biggest passage of our whole lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Terri, to close today, I want to, what would be the, like a real nugget, a golden nugget that you would want listeners to take away around this topic, right? Anything?
Well, the topic we were talking about was God, a new story, and we sort of got onto death, but of course it's all connected. On the God topic, I would say that what we need to do is work on a new definition of the divine that is not assigned human characteristics. And an easy way to do that is to condition yourself, instead of ever referring to God as he or even she, because she is human too, we call God it. And if you think of everything, any word you've ever heard about God, he loves us, he looks after us, he's punishing us, let's ask him for his help, let's pray to him. If you replace that word him with it, it changes everything.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and feminist theology, of course, wants to replace him with her, but that just perpetrates the same problem, because that's a human characteristic being assigned. God has no gender. No, and so we need a genderless pronoun.
A non-binary God.
A non-binary God, exactly, which is like a non-dual God.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Gender neutral. Yeah, that's exactly right. So that changes your view of God a lot. And the other thing I would say about that is when you're facing trauma and loss, and your faith as you have always held it no longer serves you, and you see this all the time with parents who've lost children, is, and this is so much in my work, the people I see is, I only asked God for one thing, to keep my children safe, and now my child has died. So the hell with that God. I don't believe in that God anymore. Well, good. That's what's supposed to happen. That's how you move through Fowler's stages. Let go of that God and find a new one. That's what your growth and your evolution is supposed to be about. But when people aren't willing to do that, when they're trying to make their lived experience fit with the belief system, when the experience doesn't fit with what the system tells you, it will never fit. You have to
causes people to go bitter. That creates the bitterness. Beautiful, two powerful tools to neutralize, find a non-gender, non-binary God, non-human God, and to be willing to let the the case of your faith be shattered, and so that you expand it into a new consciousness around,
or into nothing. Into nothing is good too, because something new will come into that empty space.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Terri, thank you. Again, one more time, how people can get in touch with you.
The best way to get two websites, afterlifeconference.com, and click on the email link there, or spiritualityandgrief.com. Both of those will get you to me.
Thank you so much.
Kathleen, this has been great. So nice to see you and talk to you. It's been a long time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.